So this is a quick lesson designed for those students already familiar with the comma rules. For the best results in both your writing and any tests you might see in school, I would commit the comma rules to memory. For comma rule number 1, what you need to know is what is an independent clause. Quite simply, an independent clause is a complete sentence. A sentence that can stand on its own. Now, your loose definition for an independent clause, like we said, a complete sentence, it should have a subject, verb, and an object, meaning that something is doing something to something. So, in the following examples, you'll see a subject, a verb, and an object in each of the sentences. Now, the other thing you need to understand comma rule number 1 is what is a conjunction. Like it says, two independent clauses joined by a conjunction. That simply means two sentences that can stand on their own, but they are joined together by a conjunction. So if you're ever looking for comma rule number 1, the thing you need to look for are your conjunctions. Those conjunctions are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Or, to make sure you have this in your memory forever, fanboys. Now, here are some examples. Pause the video and see if you can locate the comma and the fanboy, joining the two independent clauses together. Now, let's look at an example together. Here you see a comma and a conjunction. However, comma rule number 1 will not work unless you have a subject in each of the independent clauses. So, if you look at the first independent clause, you'll notice that there is a dog that chased a cat. Also, in the second independent clause in this sentence, the dog appears again. In order for you to correctly use comma rule number 1, each of the independent clauses must have a subject. If you do not include a subject, then you have just written a comma splice, which is grammatically incorrect. If you look again at these examples, you'll notice that there's always a subject in each of the independent clauses. Now here's a slightly longer example. Pause the video, find your fanboys, find your independent clauses, and practice seeing comma rule number 1 at work. Now here is what you should have seen. There are 2 commas, and there are 2 fanboys. Comma rule number 2, use a comma between items in a list. This is probably the easiest comma rule to know and to recognize in practice. Comma rule number 2, like I said, is used to separate items in a list. In example number 1, you could see that the comma is being used to separate the items that a student forgot. In example number 2, the commas are used to separate what Bilbo Baggins has accomplished. And finally, in example number 3, the commas are used to separate places where Martin Luther King spoke. Moving right along, comma rule number 3, use a comma between coordinate adjectives. Remember, coordinate simply means adjectives that work together to describe a noun. Now, in these practice examples, locating a comma is really easy. However, you might want to read the sentences to yourself and ask yourself, which words are acting as adjectives? What words are describing something? Now, it's possible to get comma rule number 3 mixed up with comma rule number 2. But again, if you look closely, these adjectives are very difficult to mistake for nouns. So if you get stuck trying to determine whether comma rule number 2 or 3 is being used, simply ask, is this word a noun or is it an adjective? Comma rule number 4, use a comma to separate an appositive from the rest of a sentence. Now, this may sound complicated, but really it's not. An appositive is simply a group of words that gives us more information about a noun. It gives us more details. Now, another thing you should know is since it's giving us extra information, it doesn't need to be in the sentence. Now, this will be different than comma rules 1, 2, or 3, so you want to notice those differences as we're practicing. Now, take a second, pause the video, read the following examples, and try to locate the extra information that is telling us more about a noun. Now, here are a few easy ways to recognize comma rule number 4. Remember, a comma rule number 4 separates an appositive from the rest of the sentence. So let's look at the sentence. Let's start with number 2. What is being separated from the sentence? Well, in example number 2, the English teacher in room 11 is separated from the sentence. Also, we know that it's modifying a noun. It's telling us more about someone. So what we can do is we can draw an arrow from the appositive to the noun so we see what is being modified. Also, another way to recognize an appositive is that you can cross out the appositive and you will still have a complete sentence. Mr. Burnett loves his coffee. Complete sentence? Yep, that is comma rule number 4. Now, if you look at number 4, you'll realize that the comma is not acting like comma rule number 1, 2, or 3. The Emerald City is giving us more information about Seattle. Therefore, it is separated from the rest of the sentence. Now, here's some more practice. Pause the video and take a look over these examples. You should practice understanding how you know that comma rule number 4 is at work. Comma rule number 5. Use a comma after a dependent clause preceding the main clause of the sentence. Now remember, a dependent clause depends upon an independent clause. An independent clause is a sentence that can stand on its own. A dependent clause cannot. Therefore, they need to be linked together. Usually, a dependent clause starts with a preposition. Now, here's a list of common prepositions. One thing you'll often notice is that prepositions have to do with either time, when something happens, or space, where something is located. Now, here's some practice for you. Pause the video, take a second, look for your prepositions, look for your dependent clauses, and look for your independent clauses. Now, here's what you should have seen. You should have seen that each of the examples had a very, very clear dependent clause and a very clear independent clause. Remember, an independent clause can stand on its own as a complete sentence. A dependent clause needs the independent clause. Okay, you're done with your review. Now, here are 10 examples, and each example only has one comma rule at work. Pause the slides and try to identify which comma rule you see at work. The answers will come after these 2 slides. And here are your answers. If you got any wrong, go back, review the lessons, or of course you can see Mr. Burnett after school. Now, for those of you doing your homework, you'll want to record these answers to turn in to me on Tuesday when you get back from school. Hope you had a great weekend.